3 months after Dietrich Bonhoeffer's sermon on January 31st, 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power as the Chancellor of the German nation. Though he was wisely coy about the details, he was nonetheless deeply dedicated to fundamentally changing Germany. This meant bringing everything in German life, including the German church, into line with Nazi doctrines. Once he had the power and the opportunity to act, Hitler did so with lightning speed, and things changed very quickly. Some of the changes were official in the form of legislation and decrees, but others were less obvious. For example, just 2 days after Hitler came to power, Bonhoeffer gave an important radio address. It had been scheduled for some time, so he did not give it as a response to Hitler's ascension. But in that address, given on the first day of February 1933, Bonhoeffer spoke pointedly on leadership, and specifically on something called the leadership principle, an idea that had been popular in Germany over the previous 2 decades and which was centrally important to Hitler's view of himself. The German word for leader is Führer, and Hitler had, with evil brilliance, put himself forward as the leader, der Führer, that Germany needed at that time. He presented himself as the living embodiment of this idea, and there can be no question that it had messianic overtones to anyone paying attention, as Bonhoeffer certainly was. So when Bonhoeffer addressed the question of leadership in his speech, he was attempting to explain that the biblical idea of leadership was dramatically and utterly opposed to Hitler's idea of it. The Bible speaks of servant leadership. He who would be first must be last. Jesus himself famously modeled this for his disciples when he took on the role of a lowly slave and washed their feet. Bonhoeffer contended in his address that if a leader's main objective was to idolize himself, that leader was not exhibiting true godly leadership, but was in fact a misleader of the people he pretended to lead. We in America have always understood the biblical idea of leadership, whether we explicitly recognized it as such or didn't. If we the people are to govern ourselves, we are obliged to reject the idea of leaders who do not serve those whom they lead. Though we have sometimes forgotten about it, our American idea of self-government comes to us in no small part from the biblical model, which our founders used heavily, in which the Israelites made a covenant directly with God. So we can easily see how the popular Führer or leader principle that catapulted Hitler to power and helped him stay there would have been deeply distasteful to someone like Bonhoeffer. It was a bold and vital speech that Bonhoeffer gave that day on the subject, but because Hitler was now chancellor, something strange happened. Somewhere in the middle of the speech, the broadcast was cut off. No one knew for sure whether higher-ups in the Nazi regime made this happen, but it is hard to imagine that they hadn't. Circumstances in Germany had changed quite suddenly, and what would have gone swimmingly a week earlier might no longer work at all. To put it in our own modern parlance, Bonhoeffer had just been canceled. There were many similar experiences to come for him, but this was his own first taste of the new world into which all Germans had just entered. One of the important themes of Bonhoeffer's life story is speaking the truth in love, even if it is not popular. We must not be thoughtlessly dragged along into the mainstream of worldly thinking, not even when it infiltrates the church, not even when it persuades many pastors. Dietrich Bonhoeffer understood that with Hitler now officially in charge, Germans who opposed him would need more courage and wisdom than the sleepy mainstream Christianity had given them. Many of them seemed to think that what might have worked in 1915 or 1925 would still work in 1935. They were not understanding the urgency of their situation. They refused to see the cliff approaching and to act accordingly. We will go into more of these reasons. But the fact is, their choice to maintain business as usual, listening to each other more than listening to God, caused them to fail to hear the warnings of God's servants speaking to them, like Bonhoeffer, until they had already gone over the edge. All because they wanted to pretend that there was no cliff, to pretend that their way of life was not under attack. They had so prioritized human approval that they had forgotten how to lean on God. They built up such self-reliant momentum that they ran out of time to slow down, shift gears spiritually, and begin to build up momentum in God reliance, like the Psalm 91 faith-filled focus that changes earthly circumstances tells us about. When the giant descended upon Israel, David was ready. When socialism descended upon Germany, they were not ready. What we are doing during the seemingly unimportant times prepares us for the obviously important times, crucial decisions. Don't waste your downtime. There is another battle coming. Are we ready to drive out the forces that stand against our own nation? Are we ready to name the lies that infiltrated our governments, our society, our churches? Many well-intentioned pastors and leaders sincerely believe that we should just talk about love, just promote unity, just make sure that everyone feels good, even while their ship is going down. Sadly, this is exactly what many church members wanted and expected of their spiritual leaders. It is exactly as Jesus described, the blind leading the blind, and both falling into a pit. However, some believers see more clearly, and they are praying for church leaders to acknowledge the enemies arrayed against us and train us for the fight. As the scriptures say, you train my hands for war. After all, isn't this precisely why we have been studying the Bible and listening to sermons over the years? Was not all of that preparation for hours of decision like these? But in many churches, the shallow business as usual continued. Christian leaders traded what was correct for what was convenient and culturally acceptable in order to keep the people content. But God never said, do whatever you have to do to keep the people coming to your church services. On the contrary, God told us to make disciples, disciplined ones. Who among us show up at a church meeting because we want discipline in our lives? Because we want to be discipled. We want to become the Lord's disciplined ones. Do we join a church like a soldier joins the military, ready to be changed, formed into what God would have us be? Or do we look for and join a church like a civilian joins a social club, looking to be amused and entertained, get some interesting thoughts and pleasant feelings, and move on with our own lives? The most commonly used name for God in the Bible is Lord of Hosts. Hosts as in military forces, the leader of heaven's armies. Why? Because the Bible is reminding us that we are in a very real war that is still unfolding, where God is allowed to intervene only to the measure of our attention on Him, paying attention to what He is saying and being changed thereby. God is fighting for our attention, not for control. God does not seek to control us. God is relational, not manipulative. But to better understand where we are, we return to the German church at the beginning of the socialist Nazi regime. As soon as Hitler came to power, he swiftly began to make his moves toward subduing the people. He knew if he was to be successful, he would have to bring the German church to bow before the German state. Of course, he did not speak openly about what he had on his mind. But Bonhoeffer saw precisely what was happening and began to speak out about it to the Christians around him and their leadership. If they did not change course, Jesus would spiritually remove their lampstand, as it says in the book of Revelation, and heaven would no longer recognize them as a church. They would be just another religious club seeking human approval from each other, like so many once great Christian churches have become, even in America. Bonhoeffer saw clearly that a reckoning was on the horizon. It was not possible for that church to remain a real church if it submitted to Nazi leadership. Biblical thinking and Nazi ideology deviated dramatically on fundamental points. But most German Christian leaders, pastors, ministers, influencers, simply did not see this when Hitler first took power. Or perhaps they so wanted to preserve their distracted way of life that they did not want to see it. It is extraordinary how quickly the Nazis moved to change things and how cleverly they acted to destroy the democratic process that had been in place for so long. And yet precious few children of God spoke the truth of the matter aloud for others to hear and respond in time, as God was calling them to do. What the Nazis did first, a mere 4 weeks into Hitler's chancellorship, was to use the supposedly random incident of the Reichstag fire, in which a Dutch madman set fire to the German parliament building. The socialists immediately took advantage of the understandable public fear and confusion to enact unprecedented, sweeping emergency decrees that suddenly allowed Hitler to trample the rights of the people, all in the name of public health and safety, because of his convenient plandemic. He was able to act without the approval of the German parliament. It was a stunning erasure of German government with blitzkrieg swiftness. It is still a question whether the Nazis themselves enabled the arson so they could use it as a pretext for what they did next. The Nazis controlled the media narrative and instantly whipped up a hysterical fear of any and all who might stand against them, especially their political opponents, whom they insisted were to blame for the burning of the Reichstag, despite evidence to the contrary. But it was a useful fiction for the socialists, and they made the lie big and said it over and over, as their propaganda minister instructed. And in order to do the things they wished to do, they needed to demonize their enemies in the minds of the public, many of whom were rounded up and imprisoned, and to crush dissent by instilling fear in anyone who wished to object. Can we think of any parallels in our own time? Have we seen unconstitutional mandates and denial of our rights, all for the sake of some fear-based media narrative where any professionals who dare to disagree were silenced, sued, or worse? Have we been pressured to comply and threatened with fines, loss of jobs, or even imprisonment if we questioned authority? The Reichstag fire paved the way for much else. Soon thereafter, on April 7th, 1933, Hitler signed the, quote, Restoration Act, end quote. The socialist Nazis' efforts at the widespread genetic alteration of the country made it illegal for anyone with the wrong kind of blood to hold a government position. In time, these genetic restrictions would be extended to other professions, as the socialists were always expanding their powers over society. Of course, all the while under the guise of health and safety and unity, the good of the nation. Then anyone who challenged socialism was instantly accused of being against health, against safety, against unity, in order to seduce or at least silence average people. Evil, power-grabbing movements publicly present a solution to the problem they secretly created. They set the stage, doing the work of the villain in darkness, so they can show up in the spotlight as the hero, to supposedly save the people from the mess that they created behind the scenes. But such evildoers always blame and frame any potentially real hero as the source of the problem. And this sows confusion and distrust among the masses, many despairing of ever discovering the truth and knowing which side to stand for because of the deliberate misinformation campaign against them. This is political theater, but with devastating real-world results. If the villains can convince the audience to believe them. So much money has been spent on propaganda because it works, as embarrassing as that might be for us to admit. Most of us like to think of ourselves as independent thinkers and not easily swayed or controlled by advertising or peers or politics. We like to think that all of our decisions are logical, reasonable, well-researched. But history tells a different story. Humanity is easily manipulated if we just hear something long enough. And if our friends and family begin saying it, and if our pastors and politicians, professors and physicians, scientists, social media influencers, strangers on the street, all begin saying it. Virtuous sounding messages like, we're all in this together, and do your part, and believe the experts, and don't do your own research, and keep watching the mainstream media, the news, and trust the science, and it's safe and effective. And we must join together to fight terrorism, racism, poverty, disease, climate change, or any other noble cause that costs you your God-given rights. And seems to always shift power, wealth, and resources out of the hands of the many into the hands of the few, consolidating power with every empty and broken promise, with every corrupt government. What's amazing and horrifying is that many in the German church, like many in the American church in the early 21st century, were willing to look the other way, even on matters of truth and justice in which they profess to believe. They wished to get along and not be seen as divisive or troublemakers or too involved in politics. They wanted the people to like them more than they wanted to be light for the people, as God called us to be, even if it means that people won't like us. It at least gives them a choice to see God's light, to hear God's light in us, flowing out of us, and establish their own guiding relationship with the Lord for themselves. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not fear the people. He was not living for the applause of earth, nor were those in what was then called the Emergency Pastors League, a group of heroic ministers who saw what was happening and chose to listen to God more than listening to the world. In April 1933, Bonhoeffer wrote his essay, The Church and the Jewish Question, in which he spells out rather clearly what he saw as the German church's role in dealing with the circumstances arising from a state hostile to Christian belief. If anyone doubts whether Bonhoeffer believed Christians should get political, They need only read this document, which may be summed up by its three central points. First, Bonhoeffer said, the church serves as the conscience of the state and must call it to account, that it must loudly object if the state was doing wrong. It must not remain silent when injustices were being promoted and enacted. Second, he said that the Christian church was obligated to help any victims of the state. For Bonhoeffer, that clearly included those whose genetics had been rejected, denigrated, persecuted. But thirdly, and most dramatically, Bonhoeffer concluded that if the state, the government, refused to change course, to listen to Christians, to listen to the church, its conscience, and do the right thing, but rather continued in its sins against the nation, then it was the solemn obligation of Christians to take action. They were not merely to verbally disagree and help the victims of the state, but were also to become actively political, to, quote, shove a stick in the spokes, end quote, of the wheel of the tyrannical state, crushing the people they are supposed to serve. To some pastors who heard Bonhoeffer deliver this essay, it was all rather shocking. Some even walked out. But already in early 1933, Bonhoeffer saw and said that Christians have an obligation to God to get political, if necessary, and to take a bold and likely dangerous stand against their own government if it turns evil. How much more so in the United States of America, where our own founding documents declare that we, the people, are setting up this government and this nation, that we, the people, are responsible for holding it in check. This was a markedly radical departure from the default mode of so many churches who seemingly read the first part of Romans chapter 13 and then stopped, closed the Bible, and told the people that God controls government and no leader gets into power without divine permission. However, if that was the proper interpretation of Romans 13, then the Bible contradicts itself in Hosea chapter 8, verse 4, where God clearly explains that the people had elected leaders against his will, and the people had chosen rulers that God had not chosen. So then, what is the full passage of Romans 13 really saying to us about God and government? Romans 13 verse 1 says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." Stopping there, we may wrongly conclude, and then end up disagreeing with many other scripture passages like Hosea chapter 8 verse 4. We may wrongly conclude, if we stop at Romans 13:1, that even the worst leaders in human history who somehow ascended into power, whether through stolen elections or violence, were all appointed, chosen, sanctioned, allowed, even put in place by God on purpose. This is clearly not true, and as we have said, clearly contradicting the message of Hosea 8:4, and many other passages where God is speaking out against the evil of leaders and rulers, giving them warnings, and eventually taking them down through the faith-filled agreement of those listening to him, prophets and soldiers. Going on to read the full context of the passage, Romans 13, we move to verse 2. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So once again, St. Paul here in Romans 13 verse 2 is likening rebelling against authority to rebelling against what God has instituted. This is letting us know a little bit about what Paul and God consider to be the definition of real, true, God-sanctioned authority versus that which just steals power and pretends to be authority, but was not chosen or put in place by God, and therefore is not authority, and therefore to whom we are not subject. Moving on, Romans 13 verse 3, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. So here in Romans 13:3, we see clearly God's and Paul's definition of authority. Rulers, authority, those who hold power, who ought to be holding power, who are put in place by God as the rightful authority, are known as such because they are the ones who cause terror in the hearts of those who do wrong. That is God's definition of authority that he has put in place. Rulers who strike terror in those who are doing what is wrong and hold no terror for those who are doing what is right. And these are the real authorities that God has instituted, who commend those who are doing what is right. Continuing in verse 4 of Romans 13, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Once again, we are seeing a clear definition in Romans 13 verse 4 of what Paul and God consider to be the authority in the land. Not someone who has stolen power and is masquerading as the authority in the land, but the authority in the land is the one appointed by God as his servant to bear the sword of judgment, of consequences, of sentencing against those who do wrong. True authority in the land, according to God and St. Paul and Romans 13, are those who are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. If so-called authorities are bringing punishment on those who do right and excusing those who do wrong, they are disqualifying themselves from this godly definition of authority that we find in Romans 13, and they are therefore not the authority in the land, no matter how many titles they bestow upon themselves or their party. No matter how many militaries or media companies they control. Moving on to Romans 13, verse 5, therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Once again, this is explaining God and Paul's definition of authority. Who is the real authority in a country, in a city, in a family? Continuing in verse 6, this is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. How many of us have known so-called authorities who are not giving their full time to governing, but are rather giving much of their time to neglect and abuse and all manner of corruption? They are therefore not authorities, no matter what they or others call them. They are not God's servants who are giving their full time to governing. Verse 7, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. And then just to further underline this desperately needed teaching on who and what qualifies as authority put in place by God, we turn to Hosea chapter 8, verse 4. My people chose kings, but they did it on their own. They appointed leaders, but without my approval. They took their silver and gold and made idols for their own destruction. As it happened, what Bonhoeffer saw tragically came to pass. He was not able to rouse the sleeping church around him to act as the conscience of the nation, which is the job of every church in every nation, to advise the leadership on what is right and godly. And real authority that God has put in place as authority will listen to godly leaders in the church, not misguided and mistaken leaders in the church, of course. We know what followed in Germany because the 12,000 pastors chose not to, quote unquote, be political and shrank from taking a heroic stand. The Socialist Party, the Nazis, were successfully able to marginalize and then openly demonize the 3,000 who strongly stood with the courageous church. The confessing church was listening to God. With the silence and compliance of the 12,000, they began arresting and otherwise persecuting those pastors who had been willing to take a stand against evil. In 1935 alone, the Nazis arrested 700 such pastors. One wonders what the 12,000 were thinking as they witnessed these things. Of course, some of them realized they had been wrong in holding back, but perhaps now it was too late, and they would have to live with their regrets, as so many did. but others likely were affirmed in their inaction when they saw what the Nazis did to those who had boldly opposed them. They felt that they had been wise to stay out of trouble, to do what the government said, and perhaps thought that those hotheads being persecuted only deserved what they got. But what is certain to us today, who can see what happened in hindsight, is that almost no one dreamt how far things would go. No one seemed to see that by submitting to the tremendous cultural pressure to conform to the socialist worldview, in the beginning they were aiding and abetting it, even unwittingly, simply by remaining nice, agreeable, passive, and calling it Christian, calling it love. Look where that kind of nice thinking and behavior got millions of people in the end. Something for us to consider seriously when we're trying to take the nice or passive way out of a serious but difficult topic or matter in our time, in government, in culture, among friends, family. Surely many of those 12,000 misguided ministers, if they early on had gotten a glimpse of the future and seen the millions of emaciated corpses of innocent men, women, and children in the death camps of socialism, would have behaved differently. Once again, we must put ourselves in their shoes, at least for a moment, as uncomfortable as it may feel. Because the mistakes they made are precisely the mistakes many in the American church have made. The Germans didn't think such evil things could happen, and of course, we now know they were wrong. But let's be honest, the tremendous darkness of evil is difficult for the average person to understand. And the devastating effects that simply ignoring it and hoping it'll go away can produce. However, God requires us to stand against it. But many of the Christians of that time decided to roll with it instead, keeping the temporary approval of the people, while history now clearly shows them to have been on the wrong side. They could not believe that the socialists were religiously anti-Christian, anti-God, anti-truth, goodness, and beauty, and that they were essentially atheist and pagan tribalists working to eventually obliterate the Christian church. In mostly willful ignorance of these things, many blithely went along with the general mood of the time, feeling that was the safest course. Many churches hung Nazi banners and flags outside their buildings, and even inside their sanctuaries. It was a small but significant departure from the idea of displaying the German flag, which any German church happily would have done before this time. But healthy patriotism was no longer enough, so hanging the swastika, what was called the crooked cross, may be seen as the virtue signaling of that time. It may also be plausibly compared to when well-meaning churches today display rainbow banners or BLM flags, various other signs approving of dangerous cultural trends and tides. Most of them know not what they do and are only trying to show solidarity with those they have deemed somehow disenfranchised. They only wish to show that they are inclusive and loving and accepting, non-judgmental, and not like those other rigid, narrow-minded churches who point out a difference between good behavior and evil behavior, between healthy choices and unhealthy choices that affect neighborhoods and nations. These well-intentioned but sleepy churches have lost vital connection with what the Word of God says. They don't seem to know the real forces behind such banners and signs and slogans, and are walking into a trap, deceived by the masquerade of platitudes and pleasantries. As soon as they have the cultural and political power, these deceptive forces plan to show their dedicatedly atheist colors and will demonstrate very clearly what they think of such quaint Christian virtues as mercy and humility and love of one's enemies. This is too painful for many to imagine, so they simply look away and denounce those who would point such things out. At present, they are happily playing with fire and haven't gotten burned yet. Although many might be shocked to hear such comparisons, we must understand that our shock is only because we have the advantage of knowing what eventually happened in places like Germany and in other similarly tragic events in human history where the people of God decided to become distracted from God and stopped being the conscience of the country. We must be clear that in the beginning of these troubles in 1933 and 1934 especially, few Germans saw the swastika as anything but benign. They could not dream of what it would become and what it would come to mean in the years ahead. That what seemed initially as a hopeful symbol of the new Germany would someday become one of the most well-known signs of hatred and death, with downright satanic overtones. In the earliest years of the socialist Nazi regime, most pastors only knew that if they went along with the crowd in showing support for the Führer, the new leader, they would be thought of as above suspicion and left alone, allowed to carry on with their lives and ministries as usual, at least for a while. They were simply making sure that others knew that they didn't wish to take any dramatic stand against the current regime. They wanted to be nice and were hoping to be treated nicely, therefore. It was, for many, a way of publicly saying they were only interested in staying within the confines of their own religious sphere. They only wished to, quote unquote, preach the gospel and not to get involved in government or social issues of the day or culture wars. So, to be fair to many of these 12,000 misguided ministers in these first years, the idea that Hitler would gain a death grip on the nation for 12 long years was unthinkable. And the idea that he would create death camps in which millions would be murdered was virtually unimaginable when the Nazis first took power. However, by choosing to listen to God, Bonhoeffer knew the concessions the church was making would be fatal in the years to come. He knew that their ignorance, silence, inaction, and theological confusion were not only helping evil gain a foothold, but were lending evil a helping hand. Around the time of his involvement in the Manhattan Declaration, the famous Chuck Colson referred to the concept called the spiral of silence, which he had encountered in the work of German sociologist and political scientist Elisabeth Noel Neumann. She coined it in the 1970s when writing about what had happened in Germany in the 1930s. Born in Berlin in 1916, she had lived through the Nazi socialist regime and was herself initially generally pro-Hitler, as he was initially correcting a lot of the vices and evil excesses and immorality in much of German culture and Berlin at the time. She had even met him while a university student. But when the war was over and everyone saw the inexpressible horrors of the Holocaust, she began to think differently. She wondered, most specifically, why so few of those who had privately opposed Hitler said nothing until the war was over and the danger of speaking out had passed. From this, she came up with the concept called the spiral of silence. It refers to the idea that when people fail to speak, the price of speaking rises. As the price to speak the truth rises, still fewer speak out, which further causes the price to rise, so that fewer people yet will speak out, until a whole culture or nation is silenced. Every average citizen who would have spoken out earlier against a more immediately obvious evil took their time, watched, waited until evil had such a grip on their culture that it now would be far too expensive, too costly for their way of life, or even their life itself, to speak out, say this is wrong, this must stop. And this culture of silence by fear is what happened in Germany. So the idea attributed to Bonhoeffer that silence in the face of evil is itself evil is borne out in Noel Neumann's formulation, the spiral of silence. If you do not speak, you are not being neutral. You are not keeping the peace, but are contributing to the success of the thing you refuse to name and condemn as evil, giving it time to grow and silently influencing those around you to also remain silent as evil grows and the price of speaking rises. Contrarily, it follows that those who speak the truth out early against evil that hurts people and destroys cultures, they make it easier for others to likewise speak the truth. Just as cowardice begets cowardice, courage also is contagious. When we speak out the truth early and in love for the good of people, we inevitably encourage others to speak out the truth along with us, even in their own cultures, languages, nations. And this lowers the price of speaking out. So there is no way to remain neutral in the war between good and evil into which we have been born here on earth. Either we help evil or we fight evil. Either we speak and thereby help others to speak truth, or we cower in silence, thereby leading others to do the same. Even while we may be secretly hoping for someone else to come along and speak out the truth and take the hit so that we don't have to. This must be the job of Christians, of the church, and especially of pastors, ministers, spiritual leaders, to be the lighthouse of Christ on earth, showing the way and warning against the dangers, lest we shipwreck ourselves on the rocks of evil and the devil, the fallen world in its ways, and all of its seductive lies masquerading as light and love and unity. Perhaps the main question for most of us is whether we are willing to pay the price of speaking the truth in love. If we truly understand the situation, if we are willing to learn about the situation of our time, do pastors who refuse to speak the truth fear that they will lose congregants and that the money and donations will decrease and their church will wither away, so that in their minds they are simply being prudent or even pleasing God by pleasing the people? Jesus never said, keep everyone happy. Jesus said, you are the light. But being the light might mean that the darkness will identify you as its enemy all the sooner. We are born into a world at war. Are we training for the fight?